Have archaeologists discovered the bones of Jesus? That is what some are claiming. This is actually a controversy that has been going on for some time and has recently been revived, according to Biblical Archaeology Society, that just posted an article interacting with the claim that the bones of Jesus were discovered. So, what I want to do in today's show is talk about that archaeological discovery, why some say that it is the discovery included a discovery of the bones of Jesus as well as some other things, and then why other scholars and archaeologists aren't buying the claim. So why some people think it really is the bones of Jesus, why others say no, that is not the case, and they poke holes in the narrative. So I want to take a look at that today in light of the fact that this controversy is being revived. Coming up next on the Michael Lofton Show. So everybody hit the like button and hit the subscribe button if you like this kind of material and want to see more interaction with these types of claims, various archaeological discoveries, historical considerations, biblical topics, you name it, I cover it all. So if you appreciate the content of this channel, make sure to do your part and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and also hit the bell for notifications so you know when I go live. Okay, so yeah, like I said, I was just reading Biblical Archaeology Society. They just came out with another article posted today, "The Tomb of Jesus, ? Wrong on every account." And so they argue that those who are claiming that the bones of Jesus were discovered is in fact not true, and they offer arguments as to why they don't believe this discovery really points to the bones of Jesus, whereas others have argued they do. For example, Dr. James Tabor. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of outline the arguments for and the arguments against. And then at the end, I'm going to weigh in and just offer what I personally think, my own evaluation of the subject for whatever that is worth in light of the pros and cons, the arguments for and the arguments against. Okay, so this relates to a controversy from an archaeological dig in Taupiat. Have you ever heard of the Taupiat tomb? That is what this is in reference to. It's in relation to an archaeological dig that took place back in the 1980s, but in 2007, a film was released by James Cameron arguing that the bones of Jesus were discovered in this tomb, the Taupiat tomb. So what the Taupiat tomb is it's a first century Jewish tomb etched out of a rock. And so, you know, first century obviously is when Jesus lived. He lived in various places, but including Jerusalem, where he preached as an itinerant preacher. And so the tomb is in that area. And so some people think this actually could be in reference to Jesus, especially in relation to what's etched on one of the discoveries. But long story short, this is in relation to a Jewish family tomb discovered accidentally in 1980 during a construction in East Taupiat, Jerusalem. Obviously, this is where Jesus preached and was crucified and then buried. Now, inside this discovery were 10 ossuaries, and 6 of them included some names and inscriptions. For example, one of them is Jesus, son of Joseph. Now you can see why they think this is Jesus of Nazareth. Maria is another name mentioned. Yoseh, Yoseh. Miriam, Mara, Judah, son of Jesus, and Matthias. Okay, so in 2007, again, we have this guy named James Cameron, as well as some others, produced a film called The Lost Tomb of Jesus, and they claimed this was the actual burial tomb of Jesus of Nazareth and his family. And so this sparked a massive debate, again, back in 2007, but that debate is being revived, and we're seeing it again. Hence, Biblical Archaeology Society is addressing it today. Now, why do some believe that it could actually be the real tomb of Jesus? Well, number one, they argue the name cluster is exceptionally striking. So names like Jesus, Joseph, Mary, these are very common names, but they argue the combination found here, Jesus, son of Joseph, Maria, Jose, and Judah, son of Jesus, they argue is statistically unusual as a cluster. So they believe that, yeah, okay, the names in and of themselves are pretty common in that time period, but because of the way that they're clustered here, it's most certainly Jesus of Nazareth. Now, first of all, let's talk about Yoseh, Yoseh. They argue that this matches Jesus's brother's name, and they say it's his nickname. The ossuary inscribed Yoseh, they argue, uses a very rare form of that name, and it appears only once in the New Testament in Mark 6:3, referring to Jesus's brother, Joses, Joses. And there's some manuscript variants on that name, so if you look it up in your translation, it might be a different name, but again, there's some manuscript variants that say Joses. And again, not even addressing this situation of, is this a brother, is this a cousin, all of that stuff that we see debated between, of course, Protestants, Catholics, and all that. We're setting that aside. They're just arguing this is the brother of Jesus because that's the term that they argue is used in the New Testament. Again, that term could be cousin, it could be distant relative, it could be other things. But anyways, they just argue it's his brother. And they say that that name, Jose, is the Joses mentioned in Mark 6:3. They then also argue that Jesus likely had a second burial. So, for example, Dr. James Tabor argues that Jesus's burial in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was temporary due to the Sabbath. So he argues that later Jesus's body would have been moved to a permanent family tomb, possibly the one in Talpiot. And then another argument is that they'll say the early Jesus movement was based in Jerusalem. Jesus's family and closest disciples lived in Jerusalem for decades, making a Jerusalem family tomb plausible, they argue. They also want to say that the Miriam ossuary, that Miriam inscription and name that we mentioned earlier, might refer to Mary Magdalene. So there's a decorated ossuary reading Miriam, also called Mara. And they say this is Mary Magdalene based on a rare Greek form of the name and later texts calling her Miriam by this name. Now, if this is true, this then supports the notion of a Jesus family tomb. They then also argue based on DNA testing. They say that DNA testing suggested the Jesus here and Miriam ossuaries did not belong to siblings or a mother-son relationship, and they argue this opens a possibility of a spousal relationship. And then they'll, of course, attempt to argue, based on some other texts, that Jesus had a spousal relationship with Mary Magdalene. And then they argue a possible link to the James ossuary, which we're going to do a separate video on later. But this is a 2020 geometrical study. In fact, there's been a number of studies on it, archaeological studies in relation to this alleged James, the brother of Jesus ossuary. A 2020 geometrical study, however, was done on it. And they suggest that the controversial James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus ossuary, may have originated from the same tomb as the Talpiot tomb. And so they say, based on this discovery and study, there's a relationship between these two tombs. More on that another time, because again, we need to devote a whole separate episode to the James brother of Jesus archaeological discovery that was made. Sneak peek, some believe that it was a hoax. Others argue it's authentic. For example, again, Dr. James Tabor argues it's authentic. So, overall, supporters of this theory argue that the tomb fits the expected family members remarkably well. And so some think that, okay, this is very clear evidence that um, the bones inside this Jesus tomb belong to Jesus. That would then be a refutation of Christianity and a refutation of especially the resurrection. And I think that you don't have really Christianity without the resurrection, right? And the Apostle Paul talks about that in the New Testament as well. And so this would be something that would undercut Christianity as a whole, if true. Now, many scholars reject that the Talpiot tomb is the tomb of Jesus, but upon what basis? Is this just on the basis of, dogmatic commitments, on the basis of one's faith? Or is this on the basis of actual argumentation? Well, some of the arguments that they use is Jesus's family was poor, and they say that this Talpiot tomb is a wealthy Jerusalem tomb. So they say it just simply couldn't have belonged to the family of Jesus of Nazareth. So family rock cut tombs with ossuaries were used by wealthy people in Jerusalem, elites, not Galilean peasants like Jesus's family. They also argue that Jesus's family lived in Galilee, not Jerusalem. Of course, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, he is an itinerant preacher, so he's all around. He goes to Jerusalem often, preaches in Jerusalem. The argument would be that, well, maybe, he and his family had a place there. Although, elsewhere at one point in Jesus' ministry, he notes he doesn't have anywhere to lay his head, right? So maybe that indicates that he didn't have a place. But perhaps some would argue, well, maybe he didn't, but family members of his did have a place in Jerusalem. But, people who reject this theory say, look, this belonged to a wealthy family. Jesus's family wasn't wealthy, so it certainly would not have belonged to him or his family. They also argue that the Jesus ossuary lacks any title. They say if this were Jesus of Nazareth, early followers would almost certainly have inscribed Jesus the Messiah or Jesus of Nazareth. Instead, the inscription just says Jesus, son of Joseph. So this might indicate it's not Jesus of Nazareth. Now, they also argue that early Christians remembered Jesus's tomb, and they argue it wasn't here that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was established. Rather, it was, of course, at the different location. And so the idea is that if this really were, Jesus of Nazareth's tomb, there would have been some kind of historical memory here among the early followers of Jesus. And also the Miriam equals Mary Magdalene theory, they argue, is very weak, because they argue that the Miriam, that particular spelling of Mary of Magdalene, they'll say that spelling is found in a later work called the Acts of Philip, which is centuries later. It wasn't even written in that location. And so to say that they're somehow connected, is based on pretty loose evidence, as well as they'll say that the Mary in the Acts of Philip isn't necessarily Mary Magdalene. And so they'll argue it's kind of a stretch to say it is. And then also Judah, son of Jesus, that inscription, undermines the entire claim that we have for this actually being Jesus of Nazareth, because we have zero historical evidence that Jesus was married or had a son. So if this Jesus had a child, the one that's, belonged to this ossuary, most scholars are going to conclude it can't be the Jesus of Nazareth. And then also incorrect identifications of some names. So scholars are going to argue that Jose equals Joseph in Mark 6. Scholars argue that the inscription YWSH isn't necessarily Jose or Joseph. They'll argue that's a misreading, and it should be pronounced Yosa, Yosah, which is not the same as Jesus's brother, Joseph. So they'll argue that attempt to make that linguistic connection doesn't really work, and it's based on a misreading of the continental text. Because of course vowels weren't there in the language at the time. So my personal opinion is just based on the arguments that I've seen in favor and against. Is this authentic? Is this really the bones of Jesus? I don't think that these are the bones of Jesus. This seems like a pretty far stretch to me. The arguments that I've seen in favor of it seem to be on pretty shaky ground, and the response that I've seen by the critics and other scholars appear to be more convincing. And so I would recommend that you take a look at that article in Biblical Archaeology Society that was just released that engages a lot of stuff. I said it was today. It was actually yesterday that they posted it. It's called The Tomb of Jesus, ? Wrong on Every Count, by Craig Evans and Stephen Feldman. So it kind of interacts with some of this stuff in a little bit more detail there. Definitely take a look at it. It's a fascinating topic, and we are going to take a look at the James brother of Jesus ossuary in another episode and consider, is that really the brother of Jesus? Is this somebody else? Was it a hoax? Is it hoax? Is it authentic? We're going to talk about all of that in another episode, so stay tuned for that. And if you like content like this, you appreciate these types of videos, let me know. I would love to hear your feedback, and make sure to, of course, hit the like button and the subscribe button. We'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason of theology.